A collision of worlds. In the heart of a tranquil suburban neighborhood, Oakwood Park sat like an oasis of calm. It was a place where families gathered, joggers found their rhythm, and retirees fed the ducks by the pond. On a typical autumn morning, the park shimmered under a canopy of fiery red and gold leaves, with a crisp breeze rustling through the trees. But for one woman, this serene environment was more than just a retreat. It was a fortress, a space she believed was designed for people like her. People who, in her eyes, worked hard, played by the rules, and deserved the comfort it offered. Karen Thompson strode purposefully along the gravel path, her designer sneakers crunching beneath her feet. At 42, she had cultivated a life of perceived perfection. A successful career in real estate, a sizable home in a nearby gated community, and a carefully curated social media presence that broadcasted her idea of success to the world. Her blonde hair was neatly styled in waves, and she wore a sharp, athletic outfit, paired with a designer purse slung over her shoulder. To her, Oakwood Park was more than just a park. It was an extension of her identity. It symbolized the affluent life she had worked tirelessly to achieve, a life that came with certain expectations. The park, with its manicured lawns and clean benches, was a place where people of her caliber should gather. And today, Karen felt as though her park, her sanctuary, was being violated. As she turned a corner on the path leading to her favorite bench, a bench with an unblemished view of the duck pond, Karen's heart seized in irritation. There, sprawled across the bench, was a man. His tattered clothing, dirty boots, and scraggly beard immediately marked him as someone who didn't belong. Worse, his skin was dark, a detail that, for Karen, seemed to confirm all the stereotypes she had built up in her mind about people she regarded as undesirable. Karen's mind whirred with righteous indignation. How dare someone like him tarnish her morning? She felt her jaw clench as she approached, her annoyance escalating into anger. This was a public park, after all, a place meant for families and respectable people, not someone who clearly didn't take care of themselves, and definitely not someone who might be dangerous. "Excuse me." Karen's voice cut through the quiet morning air like a blade, sharp and authoritative. The man stirred, blinking against the morning sunlight as he sat up. His face, lined with years of hardship and the sun's relentless touch, turned toward her. Karen stared at him, waiting for an apology, for some sign of acknowledgement that he didn't belong here. Instead, the man simply blinked, his expression guarded, as if he was trying to determine if she was a threat or merely another passing judgment. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice gravelly but soft. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." "Trouble?" Karen scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. "You shouldn't even be here in the first place. This is a respectable park, not some shelter. You're scaring people." The man's shoulders slumped slightly at her words, though his eyes never left hers. He didn't respond to the accusation, simply began to gather the small pile of belongings by his side. A battered backpack, a rolled-up blanket, and a worn cap. Karen's irritation grew at his lack of resistance. It wasn't enough that he was leaving. She wanted to feel vindicated, wanted him to understand that people like him didn't belong here. As he stood to go, she reached for her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said, dialing 911 with a flourish. "People like you need to learn that you can't just go wherever you please. This is a family park, and you're making it unsafe." The man paused at her words, looking back over his shoulder with an expression that was somewhere between exhaustion and sadness. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just stood there, as if resigned to the fact that people like Karen saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. His name was Anthony Clark, and he had grown accustomed to moments like these, moments where his very presence was enough to provoke fear, anger, and contempt. At 55 years old, Anthony had lived a life few could imagine. A former U.S. Army surgeon, he had served his country for over 20 years, surviving the horrors of war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had been strong once, both physically and mentally, a man of resolve and honor. But life after service had been unforgiving. The transition to civilian life was marred by PTSD, nightmares, and a constant battle with his own mind. His family had crumbled under the weight of it, and soon after, his finances had followed. Job interviews turned into rejections, and what little hope he had left dissolved into the cold reality of homelessness. Now, standing in front of this irate woman in Oakwood Park, Anthony felt the weight of it all pressing down on him again. He wasn't a person to her. He was a problem, a disruption in her carefully ordered world. The sound of Karen's voice speaking to the 911 operator barely registered with him. She was inflating the situation, describing him as aggressive, claiming he was threatening her safety. Anthony had heard it all before. False accusations, assumptions based on his appearance, and a society that seemed to have no place for a man like him anymore. He wanted to walk away, to disappear into the background where people like Karen wouldn't notice him. But he knew the drill. The police would come, and he would be asked to move along. Maybe worse. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as two police cruisers pulled up to the park's entrance. The officers exited their vehicles, moving toward Karen and Anthony, with purposeful strides. Officer David Hernandez, a seasoned officer in his mid-40s, led the way, his partner, Officer Rachel Lawson, close behind. "Ma'am, we received a call about a disturbance," Officer Hernandez said, his tone professional but calm. "Yes, thank you for coming," Karen replied, her voice thick with feigned distress. "That man over there, he's homeless, and he's been harassing me. I didn't feel safe." Officer Hernandez's gaze shifted to Anthony, who stood quietly, his hands visible, and his posture unthreatening. He sized up the situation quickly. In his years of experience, he had come across plenty of people like Karen, people whose fears were often rooted in their own biases, not in any real danger. "Sir," Hernandez said, addressing Anthony, "may I see some ID?" Anthony nodded and fished out a worn ID card from his pocket, handing it over without protest. Officer Hernandez scanned the card briefly before handing it back. "Mr. Clark, is there somewhere else you can go?" Hernandez asked, though there was no malice in his voice, only the fatigue of someone who had asked this question too many times before. "I'll move along," Anthony said quietly. He had no choice. Karen watched the exchange with smug satisfaction, confident the officers would handle the situation as she expected. But she was in for a surprise. Instead of escorting Anthony away with cuffs or threats, Officer Hernandez paused and asked, "Mr. Clark, did you serve?" Anthony's head tilted slightly, taken aback by the question. His weary eyes met the officers, searching for judgment but finding none. "Yes, sir. U.S. Army, 20 years. Hernandez's expression softened as recognition passed between the two men, two veterans whose paths in life had diverged dramatically. A conversation began that Karen wasn't privy to, one rooted in shared experiences of military service, sacrifice, and the often harsh realities of life after combat. Karen's impatience grew. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Why weren't they arresting him? Why weren't they doing their job? Her frustration boiled over, and she took out her phone, ready to escalate the situation further. But what happened next would change her world in ways she couldn't have predicted. A new reality. Karen Whitfield sat in her car, the sound of her breathing filling the enclosed space. Her fingers were still clenched around the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She had been sitting there for almost half an hour, parked just outside Oakwood Park, debating whether or not to step outside. A part of her wanted to leave, to drive far away from this place and from the memories of the past week. But that wouldn't solve anything. She sighed and stared out the window. Oakwood Park. It had always been her retreat, her sanctuary from the world. But now it had become the place that had shattered her life. She no longer felt the peaceful escape it had once offered her. Instead, it felt like a battlefield, a place where she had been exposed for what she was, or what people now thought she was, a racist, a Karen. Karen shook her head. He hadn't thought of herself that way before. She never saw herself as one of those people. But everything was different now. People had seen the video, watched her scream in the park, berating a homeless veteran. She wasn't that person, or at least she didn't think she was. Yet here she was, trying to make sense of it all, trapped between who she thought she was and the undeniable evidence of what she had done. She slowly opened the car door and stepped out, breathing in the cool afternoon air. The park was quiet, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze the only sound. As she made her way down the gravel path, her thoughts kept churning. She had always believed she was a good person, someone who upheld the values of her community, who stood for what was right. But now, her carefully constructed image had crumbled. Her friends, those she had thought would stand by her, had distanced themselves. Her job was gone. Her name was trending online for all the wrong reasons. Karen approached the bench where everything had started. Her heart sank as she noticed a familiar figure seated there. It was John Williams. He was sitting upright, his posture more relaxed than it had been that day, though his clothes were still worn and his face lined with exhaustion. He wasn't the dangerous vagrant she had described in her panic and anger. He was just a man, broken by life's hardships, trying to survive. Her chest tightened with guilt. John didn't seem to notice her at first. He was staring off into the distance, lost in thought. She considered turning around, leaving before he noticed her, but something held her in place. She couldn't run from this any longer. She approached the bench slowly, hesitating just a few steps away. "Excuse me," she began, her voice softer than she intended. John glanced up, his face showing brief surprise, then recognition. His eyes, though tired, were clear and calm. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. Karen swallowed hard. I wanted to apologize," she said, her words stumbling over each other. "For what happened last week. For what I said. For everything." John continued to watch her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension and unspoken words. Karen's hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. "I didn't mean to." She stopped herself. The excuses that had been swirling in her mind, the stress, her own frustrations, her fears, suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. She let out a sigh. "I don't know what I meant. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." John finally spoke, his voice steady but worn. "It's not the first time something like that's happened to me." He paused, his gaze shifting back toward the pond. "But I appreciate the apology." His words, though calm, hit her hard. Karen felt a lump form in her throat. She had expected anger, bitterness, something more explosive. Instead, his response was quiet, almost resigned, as if he had been through this cycle of prejudice and apologies more times than he could count. "I can't undo what I did," Karen continued, her voice trembling. "But I want to try to make things right. I know I can't just fix it, but—" She trailed off, unsure of what else to say. John turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her feel small. Not because he was judging her, but because he wasn't. He was tired. He was tired of being the target of people's fears and prejudices. He was tired of being in a world that saw him as less than human. "I'm just trying to get by," John said quietly. "Same as everyone else." Karen nodded, unsure of how to respond. The words she had rehearsed on the drive over suddenly felt inadequate. "I've been trying to figure out why I reacted the way I did," she said, more to herself than to John. "And I think I was just scared. Not of you," she added quickly, "but of losing control, of everything going wrong in my life, and not being able to fix it. But that's not an excuse for what I did." John was silent, letting her words hang in the air. Finally, he said, "We all got our battles." Karen nodded again, her throat tightening as tears threatened to well up. She had come here to apologize, but now she realized how shallow her apology felt. It wasn't enough to just say she was sorry and expect everything to be forgiven. She had hurt him, and there were no easy fixes for that. "I don't know what else to say," she admitted, feeling helpless. "You don't have to say anything else," John said softly. He stood up slowly, gathering his worn-out bag from beside the bench. "Just think about it. That's all I ask." Karen watched as he slung the bag over his shoulder and started to walk away. She wanted to call out, to stop him, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say that would make any difference? As John walked away, Karen sank down onto the bench, her head in her hands. The cool breeze swept through the park, rustling the leaves in the trees, but it did nothing to ease the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had expected that confronting John, apologizing, would bring some sense of closure, but it hadn't. If anything, it had only opened her eyes to just how much damage she had caused, not just to John, but to herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Another barrage of notifications from social media. Comments, messages, all of them angry and judgmental. Her heart sank as she read through them, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. This wasn't going to go away anytime soon. Karen stood up, taking one last look at the park before turning and walking back to her car. She had a long way to go if she ever wanted to make things right, not just with John, but with herself. And she wasn't sure where to start. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't keep running from it. As she got into her car and started the engine, Karen made a silent vow to herself. She didn't know how, but she was going to change. She wasn't going to let this moment define her forever. She was going to find a way to make amends. For real this time. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for redemption. John walked away from the park, his feet carrying him along the familiar path back to the shelter. The encounter with Karen had left him feeling conflicted. He had seen people like her before, people who acted out of fear and ignorance, then apologized when they realized the weight of their actions. But Karen's apology felt different, somehow. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, genuine regret, not just for being caught, but for the hurt she had caused. Still, words were just words. John knew that all too well. As he made his way back to the shelter, he thought about what Officer Rodriguez had told him. The card in his pocket felt like a lifeline, a chance to get back on his feet. He didn't want to rely on the kindness of strangers forever. He wanted to stand on his own 2 feet again, to feel like he was worth something. Maybe this time things would be different. Maybe this time something would finally change. Shifting sands. John Williams trudged back to the shelter, his mind heavy with the weight of Karen's apology and the swirling uncertainty of his future. The streets were quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows along the cracked sidewalks. His thoughts wandered back to his life before everything fell apart, before the injuries, before the system failed him, and before society seemed to decide that he no longer mattered. He had been a proud man once, a soldier, a protector, someone who stood for something. But now he was just another face in the crowd, another forgotten veteran clinging to the fringes of society. John's hand drifted to his pocket, feeling the small, worn business card Officer Rodriguez had given him days earlier. The officer's words echoed in his mind. "This might be your way out, John. Don't let pride keep you from taking it." He wasn't sure if it was pride holding him back. Maybe it was fear. Fear of hoping again, only to have everything fall apart. Fear that if he reached out, he'd be met with empty promises and false hope, like so many times before. But something about Karen's apology had stirred something deep inside him, something that made him think maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying again. The shelter loomed ahead, a nondescript building tucked between a rundown laundromat and a liquor store. To the world outside, it was invisible, blending into the urban decay that surrounded it. But to John, it was a temporary refuge, a place where he could rest his head without worrying about the cold or the rain. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of stale air and cleaning chemicals hitting him immediately. A few of the regulars were seated at the long tables in the common area, talking in low voices, playing cards, or simply staring off into space. It was the same routine every day, the same cycle of survival. But today felt different. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that change was on the horizon. And that scared him more than anything. He found his usual spot at the back of the room and sank into one of the worn chairs, pulling the card from his pocket. The name on it read James Work, Veterans Assistance Liaison. The number beneath it seemed to burn into his mind, taunting him with the possibility of something better. John stared at it for what felt like an eternity before slipping it back into his pocket. He wasn't ready. Not yet. But maybe soon. As he sat there, lost in thought, a voice cut through the silence. "Hey, John." He looked up to see Carl, one of the shelter's volunteers, standing nearby with a clipboard in hand. Carl was a good guy, always polite, never prying too much. He had been working at the shelter for years, trying to help the forgotten men and women who passed through its doors. "How's it going?" Carl asked, his tone casual but laced with genuine concern. John shrugged. "Same as always." Carl nodded, glancing around the room before leaning in slightly. "Listen, I heard from Officer Rodriguez. He mentioned he gave you a card for some assistance. You thinking about following up on it?" John tensed. He hadn't expected Carl to know about that. But then again, Rodriguez was a regular presence around the shelter, often trying to connect people with resources. It made sense that they'd be in touch. "Thinking about it," John said carefully. "Not sure yet." Carl nodded again, not pressing further. "Well, whenever you're ready, you know we're here to help. Rourke's a good guy. Helped a lot of vets like you get back on their feet." John appreciated that Carl didn't push him, didn't try to guilt him into making a decision he wasn't ready for. Instead, the volunteer simply gave a small smile and walked away, leaving John alone with his thoughts once more. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Dinner was the usual affair, nothing special, but filling enough to get by. As John sat with the others, he noticed how the faces around him mirrored his own weariness. The shelter wasn't just a physical place of refuge. It was a liminal space where people drifted, caught between their past lives and an uncertain future. Some, like him, had been hardened by the streets, while others clung to the hope that things would get better. But hope was a dangerous thing. Later, as John lay on his cot in the dimly lit dormitory, he found himself thinking about Karen again. Her apology had been unexpected, and though it hadn't erased the sting of her actions, it had made him reconsider some things. Maybe it was time to start forgiving. Not just her, but himself. Maybe it was time to stop carrying the burden of all the wrongs that had been done to him and the wrongs he had done in return. The next morning, John awoke to the sound of muffled conversations and the shuffling of feet as the shelter's residents began their day. He stared up at the ceiling for a long moment before finally making a decision. He couldn't keep living like this, stuck in a loop of survival with no end in sight. He needed to take a step forward, any step, no matter how small. John sat up and pulled the card from his pocket once again. His fingers trembled slightly as he stared at the number, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure why he was so nervous. It was just a phone call, right? But to him, it felt like so much more. It felt like the first step toward reclaiming something he had lost a long time ago, his sense of self-worth. With a deep breath, John stood up, crossed the room to the communal phone, and dialed the number. Meanwhile, Karen Whitfield sat in her living room, staring blankly at the news feed scrolling across her phone screen. The world seemed to have moved on from her scandal. The internet, always hungry for the next controversy, had found new targets, but Karen's life hadn't moved on. The fallout from that day in the park still lingered, and she was still grappling with the consequences. Her friends had grown distant. Some outright avoided her, while others offered half-hearted reassurances that it would all blow over soon. But Karen knew better. The internet might forget, but she wouldn't. The shame, the guilt, it stuck to her like tar, and no amount of apologies would change that. Karen tossed her phone onto the coffee table and leaned back on the couch, staring up at the ceiling. She had done what she thought was right by apologizing to John, but it hadn't brought her the closure she'd hoped for. If anything, it had only deepened her sense of self-doubt. Who was she, really? The person she had thought she was, a kind, compassionate woman, felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Her mind drifted to John. She wondered what he was doing, where he was now. Had her apology meant anything to him? Had it made things worse? She wasn't sure, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Karen glanced at the screen, expecting another useless notification, but her breath caught when she saw the message. It was from her sister, Jessica. "Karen, we need to talk. I know things have been rough, but you can't keep isolating yourself like this. Call me when you're ready." Karen stared at the message for a long time. Jessica had always been the strong one, the one who held things together when the world seemed to be falling apart. Karen wasn't sure she could handle talking to her sister right now, not when she was still trying to figure out who she was. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to stop running from the people who cared about her, just like she needed to stop running from herself. With a sigh, Karen picked up the phone and dialed Jessica's number. On the other side of the city, John sat in a small, dimly lit office across from James Rourke. The Veterans Assistance Liaison was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, his office cluttered with files and framed photos of military units. The conversation had been brief so far, but John could tell Rourke was serious about helping. "We'll start small," Rourke said, his voice steady. "A temporary housing program to get you out of the shelter. Then we'll work on getting you set up with some job training. It's not going to be easy, but it's a path forward." John nodded, his mind racing. This was it, the lifeline he had been waiting for. And though he still felt that gnawing fear of failure, he also felt something else. Hope. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe things could change. Maybe this time, he could reclaim his life. Building bridges. John sat in the small, sparsely furnished apartment, staring at the barren walls as the low hum of the city outside filtered through the single window. The apartment was modest, just a one-bedroom with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom. But it was his. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, John had a place to call his own. A door with a lock. A roof that wouldn't be taken from him when the shelter closed its doors for the night. But the space also felt empty. Not just physically, but in a way that gnawed at him. It wasn't the type of loneliness he had grown accustomed to on the streets, where the people around you were always strangers, even if you saw their faces every day. No, this was different. This was the loneliness of finally being in a place where you should feel safe, but realizing that safety didn't automatically heal the wounds that ran deep. John rose from the creaky wooden chair and crossed the room, glancing out the window. The apartment overlooked a narrow alley. Not much of a view, but it wasn't the scenery that held his attention. It was the silence, the absence of the constant murmur of shelter life, the absence of other people in the background. He had thought he would savor this quiet, but now it only felt like a reminder of how disconnected he had become. Rourke had come through for him. The Veterans Assistance Liaison had helped him navigate the system, securing this temporary housing through a government-funded program. The paperwork had been tedious, but with Rourke's help, it had gone smoothly. They'd even started talking about job training, the next step in what Rourke called his path forward. John had listened, nodding at the right moments, but in the back of his mind, doubt still lingered. He wasn't sure if he was ready for all of this. The apartment, the job prospects, it felt like it was happening too fast. Like the world was pushing him to rebuild a life that had been shattered beyond recognition. As John stood there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed on the countertop. He had forgotten about the phone. An old model that Rourke had given him as part of the housing program. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him connected, at least for now. He picked it up and glanced at the screen. A message from Carl, The shelter volunteer. It was short, casual. How's the new place? Need anything? John stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. He had grown used to Carl's presence at the shelter, always there to offer a hand without prying too much. But now that John was on his own, away from that familiar environment, he didn't know how to navigate this new phase of his life. Did he need anything? The truth was, he didn't know what he needed. Not yet. Instead of replying, John slipped the phone into his pocket and turned away from the window. He needed to clear his head. Maybe a walk would help. Get out, stretch his legs, and try to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him since moving into the apartment. As he stepped outside and began walking down the street, the city's familiar sounds surrounded him again. Cars honking, people talking, the distant thrum of construction work. It wasn't quite the same as the shelter, but it was something. The city had its own rhythm, one that he had learned to move with during his time on the streets. But now, without the constant weight of survival pressing on him, he wasn't sure where he fit in. The city felt different when you weren't fighting just to stay afloat. It felt larger, more indifferent, like it was moving forward without him. John's footsteps carried him aimlessly, down streets he had wandered countless times before, but now they seemed unfamiliar. He passed by a park where families gathered, children's laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. He saw couples strolling hand in hand, people sipping coffee at outdoor cafes, and groups of friends chatting and laughing together. It all seemed so distant from the world he had lived in for so long. But as he watched these scenes of ordinary life unfold, John couldn't help but wonder if he could ever be part of it again. Could he really just step back into a normal life after everything he had been through? The scars, both physical and emotional, were still there, reminders of a past that felt inescapable. Lost in his thoughts, John barely noticed when he found himself standing outside a familiar building. The shelter. His feet had led him here out of habit, even though he didn't need to be here anymore. He stood across the street, watching as people came and went through the doors, some faces familiar, others new. Part of him wanted to go inside, to slip back into that world where things made sense, even if they were hard. But instead, he turned away. On the other side of the city, Karen sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. She hadn't spoken to John since that day in the park, and though she had tried to push the encounter from her mind, it still lingered like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Her conversation with her sister Jessica had been difficult, but necessary. Jessica hadn't sugarcoated anything. She had been brutally honest, telling Karen that her actions had hurt not just John, but herself as well. Jessica had urged her to confront her mistakes, to stop hiding behind apologies that felt more like excuses than genuine attempts at making things right. And Karen knew she was right. The apology she had given John had been more for her than for him. She had been trying to soothe her own guilt, hoping that by saying the right words, she could move on. But it hadn't worked. If anything, it had made her realize just how deep her own issues went. Now, as she sat alone in her apartment, Karen knew that if she was going to make things right, she had to start with herself. She had been living in a bubble for too long, pretending that her privilege and success made her immune to the struggles of the world around her. But that day in the park had shattered that illusion. Karen picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for a local outreach program. It was something she had looked into after her conversation with Jessica, a program that helped people reintegrate into society after facing homelessness or addiction. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way for her to stop talking and start doing. With a deep breath, Karen dialed the number. A week passed, and John found himself slowly adjusting to life in the apartment. It wasn't easy. The silence still felt oppressive at times, and he often found himself slipping into old habits, thinking like he was still out there on the streets, always looking over his shoulder. But Rourke had been checking in regularly, offering support and encouragement, and for the first time in a long time, John felt like he wasn't completely alone. One afternoon, As John was returning from a job training session that work had set up, he noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance to his building. Karen. She was standing awkwardly by the door, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag as she glanced around nervously. John's first instinct was to turn around, to avoid whatever conversation she was here to have, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the look on her face, an expression that was different from the last time they had spoken. This wasn't the Karen who had approached him with rehearsed apologies. This was someone who looked uncertain, even vulnerable. Reluctantly, John walked over. "Karen," he said, his voice cautious. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected him to show up so soon. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, but then she spoke. I wanted to talk to you," she said quietly, her voice wavering. "About that day in the park, about everything." John crossed his arms, unsure of where this was going. He wasn't in the mood for another apology, another hollow attempt at making herself feel better. But something about her demeanor made him pause. She wasn't the confident, composed woman he remembered from before. She looked different. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Karen continued, her eyes downcast. "About myself. About how I've been living. I know I hurt you, and I can't take that back. But I want to be better. I want to do something real." John remained silent, watching her carefully. He wasn't sure what to say, or if there was anything he could say that would change what had happened. "I started volunteering," Karen said, her voice gaining a bit of strength, "at a local outreach program. I'm trying to make amends, not just to you, but to myself. I don't expect you to forgive me, John. I needed you to know that I'm trying." John studied her for a long moment. He didn't know if he could ever truly forgive her for what had happened, but he could see that she was sincere. She was trying, in her own way, to rebuild something within herself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. "I appreciate you coming here," John finally said, his tone measured. "But forgiveness, that's something that takes time. For both of us." Karen nodded, a small, sad smile playing at her lips. "I understand." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. It wasn't a clean resolution. It wasn't a storybook ending, but it was a step forward, a fragile bridge built between two people who had both been broken in different ways. As Karen turned to leave, John felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, for him or for Karen, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. And that was enough. Healing in small steps. John sat at the worn table in his apartment, his fingers tracing invisible patterns across the surface as he stared out the window. The day's light was fading, casting long shadows across the room, but he hadn't bothered to turn on the lamps. The twilight felt comforting in a way, neither day nor night, a liminal space where he could sit with his thoughts without the pressure of expectation. The encounter with Karen weighed heavily on his mind. Her visit had been unexpected, and while her words had been sincere, they left him feeling unsettled. She had changed, that much was clear, but it was the kind of change that came with pain, the kind that forced you to confront the ugliest parts of yourself. John knew that feeling all too well. Forgiveness, though, it wasn't something that came easily to him. How could it, when the world had done so much to strip him of his dignity, one piece at a time? He wasn't even sure if he knew how to forgive anymore, or what it would take to truly let go of the anger that had kept him afloat for so long. Yet something about Karen's vulnerability had struck a chord. She wasn't the same woman who had walked out of his life when things got tough. She was trying to make things right, even if it was only for herself, and that effort, small as it was, had stirred something in him. Maybe he wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet, but there was something he could respect about her willingness to face her own shortcomings. John sighed, pushing himself up from the table. The room was growing colder, and the dark was settling in. He needed to break free of these thoughts before they became too heavy, so he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. The streets were quiet at this hour. A cool autumn breeze blew through the neighborhood, making the leaves skitter across the pavement like whispers of forgotten conversations. John walked without a destination, letting his feet guide him through familiar paths. The city had always been a source of noise and chaos, but tonight it seemed subdued, almost peaceful. As he walked, his mind wandered back to Rourke. The Veterans Assistance Liaison had been a lifeline, offering steady guidance as John navigated the complexities of his new situation. But Rourke had also become more than just a caseworker. There was something about the way he listened, really listened, that made John feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. It was strange, this feeling of trust. It had been so long since John had allowed anyone to get that close. The job training program Rourke had enrolled him in had been daunting at first. The workshops on resume building, interview skills, and workplace etiquette were a far cry from the life John had lived for the past few years. But with each passing day, he found himself feeling a little more hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to start over. A real chance. As he rounded a corner, John found himself near the community center where the workshops were held. It was late, and the building was dark, but the sight of it brought a strange sense of comfort. This place, with its worn floors and mismatched chairs, had become a symbol of something he hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. Meanwhile, across the city, Karen sat in the Outreach Center's break room, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She stared at the peeling wallpaper, lost in thought. Volunteering had been harder than she had expected. The work was demanding, both physically and emotionally, but it was the emotional toll that weighed on her the most. She had come here thinking that this would be her way of making things right, her way of atoning for the mistakes she had made, not just with John, but with herself. But the more time she spent at the center, the more she realized how little she had understood about the world John had been living in. The people she met here had stories of hardship, loss, and resilience. Some of them had lived on the streets for years, navigating a world that Karen could barely comprehend. Others were trying to rebuild their lives after losing everything to addiction, illness, or bad luck. And every day, Karen was reminded of just how privileged her life had been, how insulated from this reality she had been allowed to remain. It wasn't just humbling, it was overwhelming. Karen had spent the last few years running from her own discomfort, from the guilt that gnawed at her whenever she thought about John. She had thrown herself into her career, into her social life, pretending that everything was fine. But it wasn't, and it had taken seeing John again, seeing the scars that life had etched into his skin and soul, for her to realize just how far she had drifted from the person she wanted to be. Now, sitting here in the dimly lit break room, Karen felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to face it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. A message from Jessica. "How's it going? We need to catch up soon. I'm proud of you." Karen smiled softly, her heart warming at her sister's words. She hadn't told Jessica everything yet, about seeing John, about how it had shaken her, but she would. Jessica had always been her anchor, the one person who had never let her slip too far. And Karen knew that if she was going to keep moving forward, she would need her sister's support. She set the phone down and took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. This wasn't going to be easy. None of it was. But for the first time in years, Karen felt like she was on the right path. And that was something. A few days later, John found himself back at the community center, sitting in a circle of chairs with a small group of other veterans. This was Rourke's latest idea, a support group for veterans who were trying to transition back into civilian life. John had been reluctant at first, but Rourke had a way of convincing him to try things he wouldn't normally consider. The group was small, just 5 or 6 men, each with their own story, their own scars. Some had been homeless for years, others were just beginning to find their footing again. But there was a sense of camaraderie in the room, a shared understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. As the group went around, sharing their experiences, John found himself listening more than talking. He wasn't ready to share his story yet, not in full anyway, but there was something comforting about being in a room where no one judged him for the things he had been through. These men understood what it was like to feel lost, to feel like the world had left you behind. When it was his turn to speak, John kept it simple. "I'm just trying to figure out where I fit in now," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "It's harder than I thought it would be." The others nodded, some offering small words of encouragement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, at least. After the session ended, John lingered for a moment, watching as the others filed out. Rourke was waiting for him by the door, a warm smile on his face. "You did good today, John," Rourke said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It takes guts to show up and be part of something like this." John shrugged. "I guess." Rourke studied him for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Look, I know this isn't easy. None of it is. But you're not alone in this. And you don't have to figure everything out all at once." John nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. But he appreciated Rourke's words all the same. As he stepped outside into the fading daylight, John felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The world still felt uncertain, still felt heavy at times, but there was something else, too, a small spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to heal. Not all at once, but in small steps, one day at a time. And for the first time, in a long time, that felt like enough. A glimpse of tomorrow. The morning air had a crispness that signaled the changing of seasons. John stood at his apartment window, watching as people bustled through the streets below, their lives seemingly filled with purpose. It was a stark contrast to the haze that had surrounded his own existence for so long. But today, he felt different. Today, there was something stirring inside him. An unfamiliar but welcome sensation of anticipation. Today was the first day of his new job. It wasn't a fancy job by any means, warehouse work at a local distribution center, but it was steady, honest work, the kind of job that didn't require him to explain his past. The training had gone well, and John had found solace in the predictability of the tasks. There was a rhythm to the work, a sense of order in lifting boxes and operating machinery. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something he could manage. He grabbed his jacket and keys, his movements deliberate, but not rushed. For once, he felt no urge to flee from the day. There had been too many days like that, where the weight of living had been too heavy to bear, when simply stepping outside felt like walking into a battlefield. But this was manageable. As he made his way down the stairs and into the street, the familiar sounds of the city filled his ears. Honking cars, snippets of conversation, the hum of a world that had never paused for his struggles. He walked with purpose now, his feet carrying him toward the bus stop. Across town, Karen was sitting at her desk in the outreach center, lost in a pile of paperwork. Her volunteer work had evolved into something more permanent, more structured. She had started taking on responsibilities she hadn't anticipated, coordinating programs, handling logistics, and sometimes even counseling those who came through the doors, people seeking shelter, food, or just a kind word. It had been draining, emotionally and physically, but there was also a strange satisfaction in it. The center had become a refuge for her, a place where she could confront her own failures by helping others navigate theirs. She had grown close to the people here, to the staff, and to the volunteers who, like her, were seeking some form of redemption. Today, however, her thoughts weren't solely on the center or the people who came through its doors. She had been thinking about John. Ever since their conversation, a sense of unfinished business had lingered in the back of her mind. She had hoped that by reaching out, by offering some semblance of an apology, she could free herself from the burden of guilt she had carried for years. But seeing him again had done the opposite. She hadn't expected John to forgive her, not really. But what she hadn't anticipated was how much it would hurt to see him so changed, so distant. The man she had once known had been full of life and energy, a man with dreams and ambition. The man she had seen in that shelter was a ghost of that person, haunted, withdrawn, and seemingly indifferent to her attempts to reconnect. Karen shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away as she glanced at the clock. She had a meeting with one of the directors in an hour to discuss expanding the outreach program, but she couldn't focus. She pulled out her phone and stared at John's number for what felt like the 100th time. They had exchanged contact information after their meeting, but neither had reached out since. Should she call him? Would he even want to hear from her? Before she could overthink it any further, her phone buzzed. An incoming text message. She glanced at the screen and felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. It was John. "Hey, got a job today. Just wanted to let you know." A smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she typed out a response. "That's amazing, John. I'm really proud of you. How are you feeling about it?" The reply came quicker than she expected. "Nervous, I guess, but it's a start." Karen paused before responding, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to say something more, something that would convey the depth of her support, but she didn't want to push too hard. Instead, she settled for something simple. "It's a good start. You've got this." She stared at the phone for a moment longer before setting it down. The feeling of unfinished business was still there, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe things between them weren't so broken after all. Maybe there was hope. The warehouse was colder than John had expected, the chill seeping into his bones as he stood at his station. It wasn't glamorous work, lifting, sorting, stacking, but it was steady, and that was all he needed right now. The supervisor, a gruff man named Hector, had been clear about the expectations. Show up on time, do the work, no excuses. John had no intention of letting him down. As he worked, John found his mind wandering to the people he had met at the community center. The support group had been more helpful than he had anticipated. Listening to the others talk about their struggles, their hopes, and their fears had reminded him that he wasn't alone. They were all trying to rebuild their lives, piece by piece, just like he was. And then there was Rourke. John wasn't the type to put his faith in people easily, but Rourke had been different from the start. He wasn't just another bureaucrat pushing papers. He genuinely cared. Over the weeks, John had come to trust him, something that had surprised him. Trust wasn't something John had given out freely in years, not since his life had spiraled out of control. But Rourke had been patient, never pushing too hard, always there with a quiet word of encouragement or a knowing nod. It was the kind of support John hadn't realized he needed until he had it. As the day wore on, John found a rhythm in his work. There was something meditative about the repetition, something calming about the simple tasks. It gave his mind room to wander, to reflect on how far he had come and how far he still had to go. By the time his shift ended, the sun had set, casting long shadows over the city. John made his way to the bus stop, exhaustion settling into his limbs. It had been a long day, but there was a sense of satisfaction in it, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. When he got home, he dropped his bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch. His body ached, but his mind was clear. He reached for his phone and saw Karen's message from earlier. A small part of him had hesitated before texting her, unsure of what kind of response he'd get. But her words had been kind, supportive even. It was strange, after all this time, to feel that from her. John stared at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting. The world still felt uncertain, still felt heavy at times. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he could see a glimpse of tomorrow. A tomorrow where things might be different, better even. It was a faint light, but it was there, and it was enough to keep him going. Karen, meanwhile, sat on her couch, her phone resting beside her as she reflected on John's message. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon, but she was glad he had reached out. It was a small step, but it felt significant. She had made mistakes. many of them. And she knew that there was no way to erase the past, no way to undo the pain she had caused. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. A way to rebuild, not just with John, but with herself. The outreach center had taught her that healing wasn't a straight path. It was messy, unpredictable, and often painful. But it was possible. And that was enough to give her hope. As she sat there, the weight of the day's work pressing down on her, Karen allowed herself to believe in the possibility of redemption. For herself, for John, and for all the people who walked through the center's doors every day, seeking a second chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Karen felt like she could face them. And maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face them alone.